Hey everyone, CPO here, and in this video, it's motor and transmission mounts going into the 2019 Golf R. This is from 034 Motorsport. These are the StreetSport Billet Motorsport lineup of motor and transmission mounts. So it's going to be a two-part video. The first video is going to be the transmission mount because I think that's the hardest, and I like starting with the hard one to get that knocked out of the way. Then we'll do the motor mount, the passenger side, and this will be the driver's side. So yeah, two different videos, same intro. So you have to look at the title, I guess, to figure out which one is which. Anyway, let's get to it. All right, so these do come as a set, and I think they're absolutely beautiful. These are the Billet Motorsport line of motor and transmission mounts for the Mark 7. This is for the Golf R. They have rubber bushings, and these rubber bushings are the difference between the Street Sport and the Track Sport. So Street Sport has a little bit softer rubber than the Track Sport, but both are massively improved over the OEM motor mounts. So yeah, I went with Street Sport because I can handle a little bit of NVH, the noise, vibration, and harshness, but I don't want it so bad that I hate driving my car. So these are a noticeable, supposedly, improvement and an increase in NVH. So we'll start there. The good news is you can always change out these bushings. So if I decide later on I want to go Track Sport, all I do is replace these rubber bushings. Same with the transmission side, replace the rubber bushings with the Track Sport durometer rubber, which is a stiffer rubber, and boom, I'm in Track Sport. So these have a lifetime guarantee and should hold up very well. All right, so when it comes to the transmission side mount, there are these two brackets, and you've got this bolt hardware here, and that is because of a couple reasons. Number one, you need these to act as battery tray mounts so that you can install the battery tray, because this is going to go like this, and these are going to be the new places to mount your battery tray. And the reason why you have new bolt hardware is because the factory hardware is a lot shorter. It's not designed to go through this depth of a mount. So you've got the new bolt hardware to give you enough depth. The factory motor mounts are very thin, so they won't fit. So with that said, 034 also sells a hardware kit for the motor mount and transmission mount, and this gives you new hardware all the way around. The only thing is, here's the factory frame side bolts that will be replaced with this hardware that comes with the mounts. You can see how much shorter they are. So we won't actually be using those, but all the rest of the hardware I will be refreshing, because these are all stretch bolts. So the factory bolts, whenever you install them to a torque value, and then you stretch them by giving them another, usually it's 90 degrees of turn. And then once you take them out, you're supposed to replace them with brand new ones. So everywhere we're going to be taking out factory hardware, we're going to be replacing it with new hardware, either from this hardware kit or with these bolts that came with the transmission mount. And I'll put links in the description for all of this stuff, so you can find it on 034motorsport.com. All right, now we're installing this guy right here. All right, so like I said, I'm gonna start with the harder one. That way, once I get through that, while I'm fresh, have lots of patience, I can do the easier one after that. Now I am removing this lower shield, this plastic, they call it insulation. I don't know necessarily if you have to do that. It looks like I can get to the bottom of the transmission and the engine with it in place, because it's sort of got that cutout around it, but I think it'll be easier just to get it out of the way. So that's actually why I have the vehicle lifted on jack stands, just so I can get that out of the way and then get the jack under there easily. Now for the transmission side, it's on the driver's side of the vehicle. We've got to remove the battery tray, the intake. So It's a little bit tedious to get all that stuff out. I do have an aftermarket intake, so obviously mine's going to look different than yours, but the rest of it should be the same. Again, this is a 2019 Golf R, a Mark 7.5 or a Mark 7 facelift, however you'd like to call it. So a large majority of vehicles are going to be very similar to this. All right, so once I get that intake out of the way, I can get the battery tray out. The battery tray is held on with 3 small bolts, and then there's also a nut on the back at the firewall. So the nut at the firewall, you don't actually have to remove it. You can just loosen it up, and then it will allow you to slide the battery tray out. It's got like a little slotted section there. Now I am cutting the zip tie holding the positive battery cable to the battery tray. There's a little clip. You can undo the clip. I just cut the zip tie because I plan on re-zip tying it with that other cable, which belongs to my ethanol sensor. Now we can pull the ECU out of the way, and I sort of move this back and forth during this install, just wherever it's convenient at the time. But shoving it right down there is, most likely where it's going to end up for a while. Then 2 little nuts to remove that ECU holder. And then you just pull up on this wire loom harness thing, and then you've got 2 bolts on each side of that, which are really what makes this a pain in the butt. It's because you're trying to work underneath this wiring loom, and there's no real way around it. So swivel sockets, swivel extensions, wobble extensions, I ended up using wrenches, and then ultimately for torquing, I ended up using a crow's foot. So like if you've got a variety of options, you're probably going to find one that works well for you, but you're really just working in this confined space. It's hard to get anything in there. But once you get them loosened up, then you should be able to zip them off by hand. Now, before we move to the transmission side of that bracket, we're going to have to put the weight of the transmission on a jack. So I'm using a piece of wood to distribute that weight around, and I'm just putting some pressure on the jack. I'm not really lifting it. And then these are on there pretty tight, but once you break them free, they come loose pretty quickly. Now again, these are all replaceable hardware, should be replaceable hardware, right? So these are stretch bolts. Once they're torqued down and then stretch with the 90-degree turn, you really do need to replace them. So as I mentioned, I do have replacement hardware for all of this stuff. All of the major bolts, the tiny stuff I don't replace. All right, and I'm basically just working these off slowly, and you can see the transmission starts to drop, and then freeze them all up. I can finish them off by hand, and then yeah, that's it. There is the factory bracket, and it's pretty nasty and sloppy. So in goes the new 034 Motorsport bracket. Now it's does have the locating pins on the frame side, and what I found is if I can get the bolts started on the transmission side first, but loose, like halfway in, it allows me enough motion in that and wiggle room, literally, that I can get the locating pin sort of in their spot and then get the other 4 bolts started. Now, the other complication of this is we have to add in the little brackets for the battery tray, because the factory motor mount has also battery tray mounting brackets. So that complicates things a little bit more even, because not only do we have the restriction of this wiring harness loom thing, we also have now these brackets that we have to manage. Now, I am using thread lock on all of these bolts that are going into the frame, and the reason is these aren't stretch bolts. So I'm going to torque them to what I believe is the best spec, and we'll talk about that here in a second, but I'm using thread lock on those because they don't get stretched. And so I'm getting them in with the bracket. Notice the bracket arms are fanning outward, so the holes that are mounting to the battery tray are wider than the base of the bracket where the motor or where the transmission mount is. So just make sure you have that orientation right. I did find I can get to that back bolt a lot easier, both in this initial stage and even when it comes down to tightening and torquing from behind that loom. I can just push it out of the way. That was a revelation that saved me a lot of grief, because I was trying to figure out how to get that from underneath. And yeah, so I found that out. That saved me. I wasn't so lucky on the other side of that harness with the 2 bolts closest to the front, just because it sort of wides out. and it literally just gives you no opportunity to get around it. And all those cables are sort of tight. I did pull and tug and tried to make as much room as I could, but it's a tight fit. And again, this is what makes, it's not hard to do the installation. It's just annoying. It's a Tetris game. It's a puzzle game. If you like puzzle games, you're going to love trying to figure out, like, how do you get the bolts in? And the bolts are longer, as we showed, quite a bit longer than the factory. So even getting them in the holes and started was a little bit of a challenge. But hey, once you get them in there, get them finger tight where you can tighten them down, then you can start working on them. I found using a wrench, an open-end wrench, was the best way to get them sort of going on that front side. And then after I got all those bolts started, I went ahead and started tightening down the others. And you can see here I'm adjusting the jack on the transmission just to see if I can reduce some pressure. I want to make sure nothing's all bound up. In the end, I ended up getting it to where I could kind of feel it just a little bit loose, but not loose enough that I could turn it by hand. So I felt comfortable putting a socket on it. And once I get the ratchet going, you can see it, like, it takes zero effort to actually spin this thing down. So I'm in good shape there. I don't want to strip my threads or cross thread or anything like that. So I tighten it down sort of in a crisscross pattern and bring up the transmission slowly to the bracket, and then I start torquing things down. So here's where torque gets interesting. There are defined torque values in the VW service manual. I'll show you those, but those don't apply to these 4 non-stretch bolts. 034 doesn't give you any torque values. They say to use factory. Well, factory doesn't really work for this because we're not doing stretch bolts. So what I did is I looked at the torque values from BFI that has torque values published in their instructions. So I sort of went with that, and I'll put those on the screen here for you so you can see. These are the only ones. Oh, by the way, there's the Crowfoot I used for that one front one. Everything else, though, I'm using factory spec torque values because we're using factory bolt hardware. And that requires torquing to a certain value and then a 90-degree turn after that. So basically, I torque it to spec, and then I got a big breaker bar and pushed it 90 degrees after that. And yeah, you can see that breaker bar actually bending because it's quite a bit of pressure actually to get those things locked in. But they are holding your engine and your transmission, so it makes sense. Now, normally I use a paint pen to mark things once I torque them down, just to make sure, number one, verify that I know I torqued them, and number two, so I can look to see if they move at all. I couldn't find my paint pen, so in a pinch, nail polish will work. My wife only uses purple nail polish, as it turns out, so I have purple dots all over my engine compartment now. But you can see how I use the paint pen to mark the edge of the fastener with where the surface is, and I can just see if those spin at all ever in the future. But this is what it looks like. It's actually beautiful. The unfortunate part about it is we're going to cover it all up with the battery tray, and we won't see this side again now that I'm done with it. Yeah, it is what it is. But take a good look at it now, because that's probably the last you're going to see it. Everything goes back into place the same way it came out. You can repress that wiring harness concoction there back into place with those little Christmas tree pins. And then the ECU bracket goes back in. All this stuff I'm just tightening hand tight with the existing hardware. Like I said, all the small hardware I don't replace. Just get it snugged down. You don't have to put a lot of thought into that, and then get everything back the way you got it out. Now, if you didn't pay attention when you took the ECU out, it may take you a while to get that clipped right in, but or you can look at this video and get a sense for how it's supposed to fit in there. But it's not intuitive, honestly. The good news here is my ethanol sensor wiring actually now gets routed behind the ECU, where before it was running on the front side of the ECU along the battery tray. But since I had the ECU out, I just let it get run back behind. And yeah, I think it's actually a cleaner install. So the battery tray, remember we put those new brackets in. So hopefully, if you did it right, your screw hardware will line up with the brackets, and you should be able to start those by hand. This is the factory screws, and the brackets are threaded for them. So it should go in pretty easy, assuming you put them in the right orientation, which again is fanned outwards wider than their mounting point. and then tightening those 3 bolts down, and then I'm re-zip tying in the battery cable, and also adding in that ethanol sensor wire just to give it another point of securement there. So everything looks nice and tidy, and in some regards factory, which is kind of how I like it. Don't forget this back nut down here. You just need to tighten it back down and make sure that it's snugged up there at the firewall. Then the battery goes in towards the front and then slides to the rear. The install was easy, challenging, a little bit time consuming, and you need to have a variety of tool options. I'm telling you, the crow's foot saved my life on torquing. The tip for the crow's foot is make sure you have the crow's foot at 90 degrees to your torque wrench for proper torque value. But that really did save me, because swivel socket I had, swivel extension, wobble stuff, like all that stuff, I just had a really hard time getting in there to torque it. Easy to get stuff out, harder to get a good torque on it. That would be my advice, would be get some options for the hardware. And you want basically 17 millimeter. That was a 17 millimeter crow's foot. You're basically using 17 millimeter, 18 millimeter, 16 millimeter for the most part, minus like 13 millimeter for the battery bracket and 10 millimeter for the various odds and ends. But 16, 17, 18 are going to be your go-tos. Anyway, guys, next video will be the motor side. And then after that, I will do a drive around and talk about my experience with the new motor mounts. I'll save that for a third video so I can have some time to sort of spend with it. Anyway, guys, thanks for watching. And congratulations, you got the hard one done. Now the next one's easy.